Welcome to the Sutherland Report. Very grateful that you are joining me because I have another excellent guest. In fact, someone who's very kindly coming to make a visit for a second time, which I'm very grateful. So let's get straight into it and discuss his latest article in quite an interesting magazine. Peter Baum, how are you, sir? Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Mark. Pleasure to be here a second time. Feel very privileged to be asked again. So thank you, sir.
No, not at all. And I'm not just saying this for hyperbole. Peter, you'll be welcome anytime you wish to join me. So I'm very, very grateful. Peter, amongst other things, you write, I think on a fairly weekly basis, I think, excusing the bad English there, for Blitz, which is online. I would just wonder if you could explain what Blitz is before we get into your last article, which I think is very, very important.
Yeah, certainly. Blitz is a printed publication and an online publication out of Bangladesh.
Right.
The owner, editor, is a very brave man by the name of Shoaib Chowdhury, who spent 7 years in a hellhole of a Bangladeshi prison just simply for wanting to normalize relationships between the nation state of Bangladesh and the Jewish state of Israel. For that, he spent 7 years in prison. With the current administration, he was released, and to this day, still promotes through the publication Blitz a pro-Israel ideology. The printed paper, Blitz, has a circulation of about 40,000. The online publication, my articles go out in English, Arabic and Hindi to the South Asian demographic, and I'm told that it reaches 1.5 to 2 million people. I'm also told that he can charge more on advertising space for my articles than any of his other contributors. I write fortnightly if I can, and I think, Mark, I'm the only person. I think this is unique for both the Sutherland Report and for myself. I think I'm the only Jewish guy that is permitted to write pro-Israeli articles for an Islamic magazine globally. I don't know of any other person in that position. Shoaib Chowdhury and his staff are monitored very closely by the Bangladeshi administration. You can imagine they are continuously subject to threats, both personal at their office, and yet, although Bangladesh still has no formal diplomatic ties with Israel, the authorities do allow this very brave man and this publication to allow me to write pro-Israel articles to get out to a very hostile demographic. But it seems to, I've been doing this for about 4 years now, and I can tell you the number of death threats are on a downward trajectory. There is a number of Bangladeshi intelligentsia who do debate with me. And through Blitz, I've been given the opportunity to do various radio and TV interviews with English-speaking Indian, Pakistani and Bangladeshi interviewers, such as guys like yourself who are doing it from the UK. So it has been a channel for which the Zionist ideology can be promoted to audiences who are historically hostile. I don't think there's any point preaching to the converted these days, but to get out to a group of people who are hostile, debating with them, trying to convince them, I think there's more to be done, obviously, but I will continue to go along that path, provided Blitz stays in business.
I'm sitting here so encouraged. It's quite a sort of emotional reaction in many ways to what you've just said, because it's mind-blowing, because it's fantastic that you are in this position to engage and to reach people that many other people might think, no, we can't talk to them or whatever. I think, Peter, I am gobsmacked. I think it's absolutely so encouraging. It is so encouraging, and something that we must keep in our prayers and pray for this guy. I mean, thank you for Blitz magazine. Thank you for laying that out, because against the backdrop, as you've said, of the particular country, of the history of the particular country of Bangladesh, this is really, really important. This is so important. So thank you for explaining that so eloquently. But I am so encouraged, because this kind of thing doesn't get out there. I suppose, Peter, what are your thoughts on this before we get into your brilliant article? It's like people make so many accusations against Israel that they don't realize that there are 2 million Arab Israeli citizens living within Israel with all the rights of an Israeli citizen. And and I think historically we then think, well, hold on a minute, at the beginning of the formation of when Israel was declared May the 15th or May the 14th 1948, that 150,000 Arabs are within their borders. They were wanting people to stay as well, but they had 150,000 Arabs within their borders in 1948. That has now blossomed to 2 million. So when they get accused of committing genocide, the Gaza, in regard to Gaza, the increase of the population there, or even within their own nation, that word, of course, it doesn't apply, because people are reproducing and the population is growing. That is is quite amazing, because these facts don't get out.
Mark,
Peter,
sorry, Mark, I was going to say that's absolutely true. We've got to the stage now in the media narrative where myth has turned into facts, where a false narrative has been promoted millions of times daily and getting out to an ignorant and willing audience. But the truth is all there, it's all documented, and I continue to promote the truth and challenge the false narrative, and I've got the documentary evidence on my side. Now, unfortunately, if you go back to the thoughts and understanding of the Nazi propaganda minister Goebbels, he knew that if you tell lies often enough to a biased, willing, and intellectually retarded audience, that audience will believe in the mythology, even though the evidence is there. We see it all the time, Mark. We see it in mainstream media, whether it's Question Time on the BBC or on radio or the World programme on the BBC, on CNN. We see the mythology promoted over and over again, and very rarely, if at all, does the truth come out. You mentioned about the 150,000 Arabs that stayed in the borders of Israel, and we know that the Arab propaganda machine has been very successful in promoting what they call the Nakba. They call it ethnic cleansing of 700,000 Israelis from Palestine into Arab countries. Now, let's put that away to one side, and we can debate whether it's true or not. But what you never hear about, Mark, is the 850,000 Jewish people who simultaneously had all their assets and stolen, their property, their valuables, and were ethnically cleansed from Arab countries.
Yes.
One never hears that side of the story. So
No.
anyway, that's where we are, and I thank the powers that be, that Blitz, the staff there, the editor, are brave enough to allow me to promote the narrative that we're going to be talking about.
Fantastic, and please share our please share our conversation with them, because I think this is fantastic. This is absolutely fantastic. It didn't when I said what I did in regard to 150,000, it didn't surprise me when then we meet, in one sense we go in the Nakbar conversation, because this is something that regularly comes up, and the other thing is, and as a number of the audience, a lot of the audience are in America, it's quite interesting, I think, for them to hear what we are actually dealing with in regard to the media. And we're all right, we'll call him out when we're dealing with people like Owen Jones, for argument's sake, and you go through the list of who he has been interviewing, and then of course we get to people like Ilan Pape, and then we discover that he's a lecturer down at Exeter University, with the recent appalling incidents that have just happened. I was not aware that that particular individual was a lecturer within a university within this country, and then certain things began to make sense. In other words, we're starting to join the dots up, and then when we look at historically that set of historians like Benny Morris, I believe, along sort of with Elan and others, when they're being accused of revising history, etc. Even though Benny Morris, it's been interesting to see his perspective and views changing, etc., and even more so in the light of the appalling atrocities of what happened on the 7th of October. In other words, you have to go down the rabbit hole, so to speak, to really do the research and get hold of the facts. And of course, as we're finding, facts don't seem to mean anything these days. But let's get into your article, which I think is astounding, right? Because of the points that you're making. Now, I have put a lot of your article in the description, so if you just say again where people could go and find this article, even though we're going to go through it.
Yeah. In fact, what I've done, Mark, is I've on the particular narrative you're referring to, the original article was somewhat longer. So in order to draw people's attention, I've boiled it down into a synopsis, which so people's attention span doesn't wander. Because when you want to get out to people, you know what it's like. If you write an article pages and pages long, people's attention span wanders. So I did a hard-hitting synopsis, but the original article can be found if your viewers go onto Google, look up Weekly Blitz, Peter Baum, for example, just type in the Quran, then they will see or Jerusalem, they will see the various articles I've written on this particular subject.
No, brilliant. So you've just said it. So your article is Jerusalem is irrelevant to, and you've named a people group, to Palestinians. Jerusalem is never mentioned in the Quran. It is mentioned 669 times in the Old Testament. And if one considers the use of the word Zion, which sometimes mean, Jerusalem, meaning Jerusalem or land of Israel, then add another 154 to the 669 mentions.
So just think. Let's sit back and think about that opening paragraph. So we know from all the narrative and the stories and the film clips we see that the world at large believes that Jerusalem is absolutely fundamental to the Palestinian cause and the claims. So when you take the evidence as to why, when, and how, and then you think, well, look, the vast majority of Palestinians are Islamic, follow the Muslim religion. And yet in the Quran, not once is Jerusalem mentioned, not once. Then you expand that a little bit further, and as you probably know, Mark, in Judaism, in all our prayers, in all our rituals, whether of celebration or of mourning, 3 times a day, every Jewish person who is religious or semi-religious mentions Jerusalem in all their daily prayers. Songs that Jewish people sing, prayers that they chant, all link the Jewish religion to Jerusalem. And then you look at the Palestinians and Islam, and I swear to you, Mark, I don't know, and I've asked this question hundreds of times on social media, never had an answer back. How many, in what prayers or in what songs do Palestinians recite the name Jerusalem because of their love for the geography, the city, what it means to them? And not once, you will not find the word Jerusalem in one Palestinian song or Islamic prayer or chant. So the idea that Jerusalem has a connection, emotional, religious, historic, traditional, to Palestinians is simply mythology. It doesn't. It's a very recent narrative, started off probably by Ajhamin Husseini round about the late 1920s, 1930s, when the Zionists were coming back into the country. So the idea that the Jerusalem, as we're told time and time again on every mainstream media channel globally, is important to the Palestinians, it's important to them only from the basis that it's a land grab. If the Jews didn't have it, it wouldn't be important to them. So that's why I think it was Joseph Farah, a very eminent Arab historian, who wrote in a book, Myths of the Middle East, something like, I'm quoting here, but I'm not quoting ad verbatim. The Arabs own 99.98% of the Middle East and the Jews 0.02%. But that's too much for the Arabs. They want it all. And that's what the fighting in Israel is all about. That's it in a nutshell.
Absolutely,
So, yes.
because in your article, you make a reference to the PLO charter, and could you say what's mentioned there?
Again, the original 1964 PLO charter made no reference whatsoever to any claim on Jerusalem. In fact, the PLO said that it wasn't even in their original charter. It was only after, in 1968, where they decided that they had made a faux pas on this and amended the charter to make claim for Jerusalem to that specific demographic known as the Palestinians, who again, history and the documentary evidence is there to suggest that the Palestinians are simply a combination of numerous peoples from surrounding countries who have amalgamated in that geography called Palestine. But there was never a demographic known as Palestinian. There was never a people, race, ethnicity, religion, tribal group, nation, call it what you like, known as the Palestinians until the mid-60s. Because
we go back, we just remind, and it's important to remind of history, and please correct me if I have this wrong. So we go back to AD 135, the Romans have then, the Jewish rebellion, the Romans weren't happy, dealt with that, and then renamed the land Philistia as an insult.
Absolutely, Syria, Palestina. So in my research, the first time that there was an area called Palestine was in about the 3rd century BC by a Greek Herodotus.
Yes.
And it was just the name of a name of an area named after the Philistines, who came originally, we believe, from that area of Asia Minor that we would call the Greek islands. So Herodotus, being Greek, thought that it would be a nice thing to do to name the area after his forefathers who originally settled in the area. And then we don't hear about it again until, as you say, the Bar Kokhba revolution, where, as an insult to the Jewish people who defended the land, he was going to rename after the arch enemies of the Jews from 500 years ago, the Philistines. And what is interesting, Mark, is again when you challenge the pro-Palestinian commentators and say, well, look, if the Palestinians were truly indigenous to that area that we call, let's call it Palestine, then please tell me, what wars, battles, or conflicts did those indigenous Palestinians engage with the various invaders, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and who led them? And of course, history lacks evidence. They were never there. So the Jewish people engaged in conflicts because they were fighting for their indigenous homelands. The Palestinians not. And then you can go right through from 5000 BC. The first sign of the Palestinians, I believe, was in the 1960s. In fact, to call Arabs Palestinians in the 1930s was deemed as an insult. The head of the Arab Higher Committee, when testifying under oath to the Peel Committee, said to Sir Laurie Hammond, Palestine is a name invented by Zionists. Arabs are not Palestinians. We refute the name Palestine, etc., etc. So, but again, the current narrative won't allow this to be put forward or promoted or suggested. So yes, you're quite right. That's where historically you're absolutely right in your analysis.
Was that the Peel Commission? Because dates are important.
Absolutely.
Was the Peel Commission in 1936?
Absolutely right. 1937 Peel Commission, and prior to that, which is also interesting, Mark, a very boring report and typical of British bureaucracy and administration, the Hope-Simpson report of 1930, which combined with the Peel Commission report absolutely proves 100% that no Palestinian land was ever stolen. It's there in documented. That both reports categorize the various segments of legal land under the Ottoman Empire and brought forward by the British. Mulk, Miri, Waqf, Matruka, Mewat. Freehold, leasehold, charitable and religious lands, state land and wasteland. And none of that land, and I can quote the percentages of land, even who bought it and where it was land registered, none belonged to indigenous families or Palestinians. No land was stolen, and what land was transferred from Arabs or Christian Arabs and Muslims Arabs to Jews or Jewish organizations was all purchased legally. Yes. And that is under the Arab leadership, under oath, said that to the Peel Commission. Sorry, we are digressing away.
No. This is very, very important, Peter. We're not digressing, because all of this is very, very important, because you're talking about in your article, you are then saying why a people group are turning around and saying that is important to us, and then turning around and going, this is the proof that says it's not written in their book. But the history, the historical facts are fundamental, because it then you see, when people turn around and go, right, as the British are then leaving, by 1948, giving hours to say we will be leaving in May, right? And of course, as you know, then violence had already started in 1947. I think going back, there had actually been a pogrom within that area against the Jews in 1929,
Yeah,
I
there were
think.
several, Mark. In
Right.
Hebron, in Jaffa, and Safed, there had been several. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
No, but this is important, and that's why your knowledge, and it's wonderful to have this conversation, and your knowledge is so important because, and you've said it, and it isn't easy now because people don't want to deal with facts because it's all about emotions. And then when we turn around and say, well, how would you like it if someone said to you that, that your land is irrelevant, where you live, you shouldn't be here, and we need to then turf you off. How would you feel about that? Because you've named it. You've said the historic homeland. This is what it is, and you've made a very important point, which is no land is stolen because Arabs were actually, correct me if I'm wrong, selling land to the Jews that were returning.
Oh, Mark, the number of Arab families who were making hay, the El Tinan family, the Sarsuk family, the El
Right.
Salam family, mainly Lebanese, Egyptian, and Syrian families, were all granted land under the Ottomans because they were the ruling Arab
Mm,
dynasties.
mm,
And all that land was sold at overinflated prices to the Jewish individual Zionist organizations and charities who were willing to pay because that was, they considered it to be their homeland and were willing to pay up over the odds. There's something else that's very interesting, Mark, the narrative that has formed that is such a lie. The 80% of the geography of pre-1948 Israel, called Palestine, was in the land category Mewat and Matruka. What are those categories mean? Basically, state land and wasteland. So, swamp, desert, forest, highways and byways, ponds, etc., etc. Land, 80% of the land was not owned by any individuals, organizations, or families, but it was actually the land of the state. So when Palestinians say we had our land stolen, this was land that was owned and controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And after the Ottoman loss, after 1917, when the British were trusted with the mandate, became British land, British territory. It was not owned by any Palestinians. So then we had what we call freehold land, mulk. Now, that only accounted for about 3% of the total land area, because freehold under the Ottoman legal land system was not something that was very common, as freehold land is today. Now, all that freehold land was sold by Lebanese, Syrian, and Egyptian families to Zionists, all of it. And that is under the Arab High Committee testified on oath, I'll repeat it again, to Sir Laurie Hammond, who questioned them numerous times, what land has been stolen, and they said no land has been stolen, it's all been purchased. Then we've got another category of land called Waqf, and this is interesting. This is land that is where religious sites are built. So synagogues, churches, mosques, all built on Waqf land, and that accounts today in Israel for about 2% of the total land area, and that is still owned. And in fact, it's increased because 400 mosques have been built in Israel since 1948. So that particular category of land has increased and is owned as it ever was by the religious organization or charity. It's sacred ground, in fact. So we're left, Mark, with 16% of the total land area in pre-1948 Israel called Miri, which is leasehold land. Now, even if the total amount of leasehold land, or Miri, was stolen by the Zionists and the fellaheen, or peasant farmers, were kicked off, even if that were the case, then it would only account for 16% of total land theft. This is the historical truth. But in fact, Mark, the vast majority of Miri land was, how should I put it, possessed, not repossessed, given to the Zionists. And let me explain why. Under Ottoman rule, if you had Miri or leasehold land, the longest leasehold period under Ottoman rule was 3 years. And if you could not prove that you had cultivated 3 years successfully on that land, you had to give up the leasehold. And because of swamp and malaria in that geography between, let's say, 1908 and 1925, the vast majority of fellaheen could not make it pay and had to leave the leasehold land because they couldn't prove they couldn't prove 3 years of successive cultivation, and they couldn't afford the huge land taxes that the Turks and the Brits put on them. The Zionists from Europe came with increased knowledge of agricultural production, and they took over the leases. But not only that, they insisted that the leases were expanded from 3 years to 50 years, which both the Turks previously and the Brits agreed to. That leasehold land and Zionist agricultural production attracted tens of thousands from Arab countries into Palestine, where the working conditions were better, where the standards of pay were better. The vast amount of Arab presence into Palestine was not as a result of Palestinian natural birth rates from an indigenous population, but from Arab immigrants coming into the country. There's a newspaper clipping, 1936, from the governor of Haran province in Syria, who was complaining that 40,000 Syrians had left for Palestine to go and plough the fields, which gave him a problem in Syria because he didn't have the labour to do it. So John Finn, the British ambassador to Palestine around the 1890 to 1910 area, wrote in his diaries of the thousands of Beni Sakra Arabs that had come in, very rarely seen, from west of the Jordan into Palestine because of the economic benefits of labour. Churchill wrote about it in his diaries. Colonel Mennatsgagen, another British diplomat, wrote about it. The vast majority of Palestinians that we know today were not descendants from an indigenous population, but third and fourth generation descendants from Arab immigrants that came into the area because of the economic benefits brought about by Zionism. Now, all that, Mark, is documented in no end of journals, publications, diaries, and yet it doesn't, I don't think it's ever been discussed in mainstream media. I haven't seen or heard of this on any BBC or CNN or Al Jazeera program documenting about the area. So, but that's the truth of it. That is the absolute truth.
Well, I feel so privileged to have this conversation because I mean, I love history, but I'm in awe again of the historical facts that you are putting forward. Some of it I'm aware of, but really, really, really putting massive amount of skin layers on the bones, on the foundations, and I'm very, very grateful for that. And you're absolutely right. No one in mainstream media is discussing any of this. So this is, I think this is our challenge. I feel very challenged in that, and have to ask you to say, right, these are the references we've got to go to, because the international legality, of course, is discussed by the people like the wonderful Natasha Herskov or
Oh,
Herskov.
she's
Now,
incredible.
she is amazing. So Natasha discusses that along with maybe one or two others, but she is really a front and center on that and goes through it and defines it, the legality of independence, the land, the build up. When Hammond was asking the Arab people there in the land those questions, again, what was the year was that? Was that 36,
That
37,
was
or
30,
before?
the Pill report was 37,
Right.
and it was at a time when the pro-Arab elements in the British government were really trying to assist the Arab nationalists and their cause rather than assist the Jews who were having such issues in Europe. In fact, for a time, I think after 1937, there was a complete ban on further land sales by Arabs to Jews. The Arabs completely ignored that because they wanted to take advantage of the extortionate high prices that the Jews were prepared to pay for barren land. But the Zionists knew, with the agricultural production methods and knowledge that they would bringing forward, bringing into Palestine from Europe, they could actually make a go of it, which they did. You know, we've seen that. So yes, but it was the Arab nationalists who were toying with the idea of German Nazism with the assistance of not pro-Nazi Brits, but pro-Arab nationalist Brits, that from 1937 tried to ban any further land sales to Jews, and also tried to stop further immigration, Jewish immigration from Europe. Both of those, there were some horrible events where the Brits were successful in that, some terrible tragedies of Jews not being allowed into Europe. But as far as the land sales were concerned, it was the Arab owners who said, no, we're quite happy to take high prices for what they considered to be barren land.
Does this go back to the whole thing of Lawrence of Arabia and us? You know, Lawrence then getting Arabs to then help to fight Ottomans and all of this, and then promising land, promising their own state, and then everything blows up.
Yeah,
What are your
I'd
thoughts
like
on
to
that?
think that was the case, but my understanding is somewhat different. The Brits knew that economically, oil
Yes.
and oil production was going to serve their interests better than saving a few Jews from Nazi Germany. So it really was based on, in Lawrence's day, it was an emotional love for all things Arab.
Yeah.
But in the 30s, it was really a realization that the Arabs had the oil and Britain's economic interest was best served by assisting them rather than a few Jews who, a shame for them, but, our interests are with the economy.
Because that is then a future throwback jumping forward now. That is in regard that then that mindset is embedded within the European Union, and
Sure.
this whole thing of working with Arab states, the Pact of Arab. We want Batailleur, as you're more than aware of, has written about this, the book Eurabia, and other work, which is phenomenal. I'm a total expert on all this. The reference to oil, the reference to economics, the reference to creating the federal states of Europe to copy America without a constitution, which is another subject in itself. But people have that then for us as Brits right now, and without giving any game away geographically, that is what we are seeing coming over our channel over Dover, and no one seems to be able to do anything about these boats, or maybe that's because we've signed the Global Migration Compact under Theresa May 2018-ish.
Right.
No one is discussing that in the mainstream media.
No.
I'm more than prepared to discuss that, and so are you. The other thing, it's not stopping that. And we have been warned. We were warned by Gaddafi. I'm not defending him, but I'm just saying he's made that statement in regard, if we go around bombing his country and destroying it, he just said, you get rid of me. Then as a strong man, and that is a cultural thing that's important. That is what's respected within the Middle East.
Correct.
We don't understand that within the West. Please hear me. I'm not sitting here as some expert. I am frantically trying to catch up with history, trying to understand what is going on, and the reason being is because sadly we're dealing with ignorance, and that is why it's such a privilege to talk to you. Because would you then say, we are going to get back to your article even in the last 10 minutes, would you then say, because it's this whole thing of victim oppressor, isn't it, which is what we are looking at, how does the French and Algeria and the civil war then, and then them leaving in 1962, and I'm not sure how long that went on for in regard to putting that down, whether it was 7 years, I can't remember, and then literally overnight then leaving. How has that affected the Arab mindset in regard to pushing what they're the cool colonialists out?
Well, actually, we're seeing it today. I mean, I don't know, but I follow events in the Sahel region of Africa quite closely. And only this month, Niger, who were for years and years and years French influenced, let's say, decided to kick out the French and have got the Russians in. We'll be seeing that in Burkina Faso shortly as well, I'm sure. We're seeing all these Islamist North African nations going from one colonial master to another. Now, obviously, as far as the West were concerned, we'd much prefer the French to be in there than the Russians. But the Russians are making great hay in that part of the world. The unfortunate thing is, for the indigenous non-Muslim population of Africa, and we're seeing it every day of the week, not in the mainstream media, but Islamists killing Christians in Africa, kidnapping children, beheading priests. It's happening in Mauritania, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, in Somalia, going south into Nigeria, Democratic Congolese Republic, really all over Africa, we are seeing an Islamist expansion now encouraged by Russia. And there is a Holocaust going on in Africa. It's happening to non-Muslim Africans, and it's being perpetrated by Islamists. And again, the global media is ignoring this, absolutely ignoring this. You know, I remember when in the Rwanda Holocaust of, I think, 1994, I think it was nearly 1 million Rwandans were slaughtered in a 4-month period. Now, I bet you, Mark, if you ask most people today who killed who in Rwanda, no one would know. They wouldn't know the name of the tribes involved. The BBC,
Tutsis and the Houthis.
exactly, the BBC ignored the story completely, 1 million, and yet for decades before, they had a team of people in South Africa reporting on the disgrace that a black person couldn't get on the same bus as a white person. But when 1 million black indigenous Africans are killed, it's like, oh, well, so again, it's going back to where we started from. It's getting the truth out to those who are willing to listen and shy away from what mainstream media has been promoting these last 3 or 4 decades.
I couldn't agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. And going back to your article, because all of this is so relevant, right? And the reason why it's relevant is because you have gone through, very briefly touching on it, but also in depth quickly, of the historical rights of owning land, leasing land within Israel. And now then you refer in your article, right, towards the end, and I'll just read this. And isn't it ironic that the following Quranic surahs refer to Israel's claim to Jerusalem, and by any scholarly interpretation make it abundantly clear that Islam has no claim?
Yeah. Now, this again is interesting, Mark. And before I had the confidence to write that, you'd appreciate that it took a number of years of painstaking research to give me the confidence to pen something like that. And believe me, I have been to see Islamic scholars who are not willing to put their head above the parapet for obvious reasons, but are willing to tell me what their interpretation of the Quran is. So again, let's just be totally realistic, and we're not trying to promote Islam or any other religion for that matter. We're just taking the Quran as being the Bible of billions of Muslims around the world. And what I'm suggesting is, through the Quranic verses, a studious interpretation. Actually, it's not even interpretation, it's black and white. Nowhere, let's go back to where we started. Nowhere in the Quran is Jerusalem mentioned. Nowhere are the Palestinians mentioned. But in numerous surahs within the Quran, there is a fundamental documented evidence that the land of milk and honey, it belongs to God's chosen people, the Israelites, not and Jerusalem is theirs, not to the Palestinians, not to anyone else, but to the Jewish people. It's there. And I would suggest that supporting Palestinian claims and their calls is actually mocking the Quran and defying Allah and the Prophet Muhammad, and is it's the ultimate in Islamophobia, if you like. And many of the scholars that I speak to from their religious belief in Islam say to me, Peter, look what's happening in the world of Islam. Look what's happening in Sudan, in Libya, in Yemen, in Iraq. Is this not proof alone that by mocking the Quranic verses that Allah is wreaking his wrath on the world of Islam? Now, when you look at it from that perspective and you stand back a bit and respecting someone from the Muslim world who believes in that, sure, and it's there. And yet again, Mark, I have never ever seen this narrative ever debated or discussed on mainstream media, and yet, Mark, it's there in black and white. I've quoted each and every surah where it's a Zionist surah. I've listed them actually alphabetically, identifying the ones that stand out. But there are at least 15 surahs within the Quran that clearly state that the geography that we're talking about, whether you call it Israel, Palestine, the land of milk and honey, whatever you call it, is bequeathed, bestowed, and promised to the Jewish people, the children of Israel, the chosen race. Again, however, there's something else, Mark, that's really interesting. And again, I learned this from debates and discussions with people who study the Quran. It is very true. It is very true that in numerous surahs within the Quran, the Jews are defiled. They are the lowest of the low and are not worthy of anything other than, let's say, being treated in a hostile manner. Now, this is also interesting, Mark, and I'll tell you why. And I think many of your, I think all of your viewers will be surprised in this. I couldn't connect the positive verses within the Quran to the Jewish people with the negative ones, and yet it's quite easy to understand. And if I may, Mark, give me a couple of minutes to explain.
Yeah, go for it, please.
In the Lord Jesus Christ is known as King of the
Jews.
Again, louder.
Jews.
Thank
Jews.
you. You have never heard, I have never heard of Jesus Christ being known as King of the children of Israel, or King of the Hebrews, or King of the Israelites, or King. He was known as King of the Jews. Please bear this in mind with my connection to the hostility aimed at Jews in the Quran. The term Jews in the days of the birth of Christ, following the birth of Christ, in literature, the term Jews, the collective term Jews, was aimed at those Jews who were followers of Christ. They were, I've heard it called in the day that they were the militants of the day, if you like, and they were called Jews. The collective term for the Jewish people was either Hebrews, the children of Israel, the chosen people, the sons and daughters of Abraham. Jews, as a collective, only referred to the followers of Christ. Right. Now, that collective terminology only ended in the days of the Spanish Inquisition, when the term Jews was meant for the whole of the Jewish people. Up until then, and indeed when the various surahs in the Quran was written, the term Jews was only aimed at the militants, the ones who defied the original biblical teachings.
Are we talking Spanish Inquisition, what, 15, 14,
about 14, the 15th century, indeed.
Yeah.
So it was only then that the term Jews became a collective for the Jewish people. Wow. Up until then, the term Jews was only targeted at a specific minority who were the troublemakers, the militants. And the Quran brought that forward, and that's why within the Quran they are so hostile to the term Jews, but so positive to the sons and daughters of Abraham, the children of Israel, the chosen race. So that's the logic. So when people now say, oh, but the Quran is very hostile to Jews, actually it wasn't. It was only hostile to that certain demographic, the ones that Christ was King of the
Jews.
Exactly.
And let's just remind everyone, Jesus is Jewish. So and that's it. I'm going to round this up in a minute, but Peter, this has been incredible. But the other point I want to bring out in your article, which is when it talks about here, you talk about even when the Jordanian occupation between 1948 and 1967, not one Arab head of state visited Jerusalem. That is
Absolutely.
fascinating to me, which
Now,
is if it was that important. Now, we've only got 3 minutes, so I'm just going to, you say what you want to say and wrap up. But Peter,
no,
it's been
okay,
amazing.
Mark. Again, if Jerusalem was so important to the world of
Mm,
Islam,
mm.
then surely when the Jordanians had control after the 1948 war, and they did so for nearly 20 years, one would have thought that there would have been a number of Arab leaders who, after centuries of not being in control of Jerusalem, now had it. Not one visited. In fact, the Jordanians um, tried to uh, um, make Jerusalem insignificant and wanted all the administrative and religious capitals in Amman. They actually set up offices in Amman. The main mosque was in Amman, and the importance of Jerusalem was downplayed. So it goes back to my original point that Jerusalem is only important to the Arab Muslim world when they are not in control of it. But to suggest that they have a traditional, historical, emotional connection is utter rubbish.
Or when Queen Rania wishes to appear on CNN
Yeah,
and sit in front of a load of boxes that are going out saying this is relief for Gaza, and then doing whatever she can to bash Israel,
exactly
etc.,
so.
etc. Um, it's it's so, Peter, this may sound like a bit of a naive statement in some ways, but it's so layered. It's so nuanced in so many ways that we have such a responsibility to get the history, get the facts out there. I'll throw this out, having been in there. In the Foreign Office, there's a bust of Anthony Eden, which is a show in itself. Who, when you talk about the Arabic pro-Arabic push within the Foreign Office, and we have to remember that when people like Anthony Eden met Stalin, they were totally and utterly enamored with him. So it's this whole thing that was going on politically within that, which is another story which is fascinating. Peter, I can't thank you enough for joining me. Please just quickly just say where they can find you at Blitz, and then I'll play us out.
So on the best way to find me is either on Twitter
Mm,
or Facebook, but all my articles are on Blitz,
mm.
and just Google Weekly Blitz Peter Baum, and you will see a whole range of my articles come up on various matters linked to the
Brilliant,
Israel-Palestinian issue.
brilliant. Stay with me on the other side because I want to say official goodbye, but I'll say an official digital goodbye now. I'm just going to play us out. But Peter, I cannot thank you enough. And I think I urge everyone, don't accept what we're saying, but go and do the research and come back and let's have a discussion if you don't agree. But I think you will find that it's facts after facts after facts that people do not want to face and deal with. Please, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for following me. Subscribe to the channel, press a like. Sorry if you can't make comments yet. I'm trying to get my head around that one. But thank you very much indeed. Peter, love it. I'll play us out. Thank you.